All right, guys, in this video, I'm going to attempt to go over chapter 23 briefly. This is Metabolism and Nutrition, and we'll start talking about the metabolism portion. It's a very short section at the beginning of the chapter on metabolism. It's really understanding some of the main vocabulary terms associated with this concept, and you can kind of see the first main vocabulary. What you need to know here is that metabolism is basically any kind of chemical reaction that's taking place in the body. And that usually falls into one of two categories. It's either going to be catabolism, and that just means something is being broken down. Some molecule is being digested, and you're breaking something down into something else. And as a result of that, it releases energy. So it's an energy-releasing process. That's catabolism. Anabolism is the opposite. It means you're building something up. And so usually when you build up a molecule, you're making something, you're taking the smaller subunits, and you're building something up. That requires energy. And so anabolism requires energy to make a molecule, and catabolism usually releases energy whenever you break something down. Put these together, and the sum total of all of this would be your metabolism, your overall total number of chemical reactions taking place. And so when you talk about energy molecules, we're really looking at three of the four major biomolecules. And so if you remember back from chapter 2 and 168, you probably talked about carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Well, the first three, carbs, lipids, and proteins, are the main molecules that we'll be talking about, that when you break these down, they'll produce ATP, and that's your energy molecule. By the way, ATP is a nucleic acid. It has all three parts of a nucleic acid. We'll look at that a little later. The other major topic that we'll look at is, and we'll go ahead and start this now, is looking at aerobic respiration. We've completed the chapter on respiration a while back. This is different. This is what the cell is doing to produce energy. So sometimes you see this called cellular respiration. It's aerobic. The term aerobic probably refers to oxygen, and that's what it is. It's breaking down the molecule glucose in the presence of oxygen. And the goal is to make energy. This is how your cells, trillions of cells that you have, this is how your cells produce the ATP energy molecule that they need to go through their chemical reactions from using glucose, which is a simple sugar. The overall equation for this is listed down here for you. At some point, I think it would be a good idea to understand the equation, be able to possibly even write it out, just so that you understand what's going on in the equation. It looks complicated when you first look at it, but once you start to understand what's going on in this chemical formula, it should start making sense. So for example, we know we have to, just from our respiratory chapter, we know we have to inhale oxygen. And so right here is your formula for oxygen, O2. And when you exhale carbon dioxide. Well, here's the CO2 that you exhale. Then the other two components is C6H12O6. That's your chemical formula for glucose. That's the energy molecule that you're going to use to make ATP. And so what this is saying is that you take the glucose, you combine it with oxygen, and you produce a little waste product. That's carbon dioxide. That's the gas, like we talked about back in chapter 21, that you have to get rid of. Here's the CO2 you get rid of. You do produce a little bit of water in the process, H2O, and of course the energy that your cells are going to need. That's the ATP. This whole process takes place in three main reactions. So we're going to talk about the three main reactions. If you take this, if you take a biochemistry class, or if you go in and you take maybe Bio 111, probably we'll go through these steps and maybe a few other steps, intermediary steps. We're just going to go through the highlights of some of the major steps. Glycolysis is the first step we'll talk about. That's followed by the citric acid cycle, and then that is followed up by the electron transport. One thing to note here is that on this slide, energy comes in lots of different forms, right? You've got lots of different forms of energy, and so all of the terms here on this slide show you different types of energy. Glucose, that's a type of chemical energy. That represents the food that you eat. And so when you eat food, you break it down, you digest it, just like we talked about in the other chapter, you digest it, and those molecules you try to turn down into energy molecules such as glucose, so that you can make the ATP energy. Electrons also carry energy. And so part of one of the reactions we'll look at, the end reaction, electron transport, is all about transferring electrons and turning that into ATP. To do that, we'll eventually talk about two other chemical molecules. They're abbreviated here, NADH and FADH2. These are other chemical molecules, and their job is to carry electrons. That's what they're called, electron carriers. Their job is to hold on to electrons chemically and transfer those to reactions in the electron transport chain so that you can make ATP. And we'll see electron carriers kind of in action towards the end there. Now, this is just a little flow chart I put together to try to help organize what's going on here for aerobic respiration. It's pretty much the same as the other information. I just put it in a flow chart. What it says is for aerobic respiration to take place, you start out with glucose. First thing that happens is you go through glycolysis. If oxygen is present for aerobic respiration to continue, then that means you'll go down to the citric acid cycle. By the way, you may see it referred to as the Krebs cycle. This is just another name for this process, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. Then once you complete this process, the cell can continue, energy production can continue in something known as the electron transport system. Notice up here that after glycolysis, if oxygen is not present, then you can go into a type of fermentation system called lactic acid fermentation. And we'll briefly talk about this. If you take microbiology, you'll talk about this more. This is very common in bacteria to go through this type of energy production for anaerobic bacteria. Your cells can do this to some extent. The main place that I've seen this is in muscle cells. Muscle cells that get overworked and they start running out of some of the energy. They can go through lactic acid fermentation for a short amount of time to kind of catch up on the ATP production. All right, so let's look at the first reaction called glycolysis. For each of these stages, what I'd like for you to understand are the main concepts. What is going on in the process, where is it taking place, and some of the major concepts of it. You don't have to go through and memorize the formulas. You don't have to go through and memorize the equations. Just kind of get the big idea for each of the process. So for example, you should recognize this term glycolysis means, you see the prefix glyco refers to a sugar. Lysis refers to breaking down. And so the word is telling you here, glycolysis means the breakdown of sugar. And that's what's happening. So the process of glycolysis is breaking down one molecule of glucose, and it produces two molecules of something called pyruvic acid in the end. The other thing to note here is the location. I don't have it on the slide here, but glycolysis is going to take place. The location for this process is inside the cell, but it's in the cytoplasm of the cell. A lot of people remember the mitochondria, and we'll talk about that briefly. The mitochondria is a location for a lot of the ATP production. However, glycolysis is not part of the mitochondria. Glycolysis actually takes place outside of that organelle, but it's inside the cytoplasm. Notice that glycolysis is a good example of a catabolic reaction. It's catabolism. You're taking glucose and you're going through a catabolic or catabolism type reaction to produce pyruvic acid. Then if you notice the diagram, and you have something similar to this in your textbook, this is a little different than the one in your textbook, but notice a couple of things about these arrows up here. First of all, notice that it says that 2 ATP molecules are converted to 2 ADP molecules. What that tells me is this is an energy requiring step. ATP is your high energy molecule. There's more energy associated with ATP than there is ADP. The T here stands for tri. And so this is adenosine triphosphate. That means it has 3 phosphate groups attached. This is adenosine diphosphate. It only has 2 attached. And so the more the phosphate groups you have attached, the more energy you have. You can think of this like a rechargeable battery. The ATP is fully charged, more energy here. ADP is less charged, so there's less energy there. So what this means is it takes energy to start this process. It requires 2 molecules of this ATP to get things started. Now, then you kind of go through. You don't need to know the individual intermediates here, but you go through. But notice at the end here, you have 2 molecules of ADP. They get recharged back into ATP. Same thing on this side of the equation. 2 ADP get recharged to 2 ATP. So when you think about glycolysis, I have a summary slide that kind of summarizes those major steps that you need to be familiar with. The first one, we've already talked about this, is that one molecule of glucose is used. Second step, or the second thing here, is that this partially oxidizes that sugar. It partially breaks down the glucose. And what I mean by that is at the end of this process, you're left with pyruvic acid. There's still more energy associated with pyruvic acid. So you haven't completed the process of ATP production yet. You've only partially started it. 2 NADH molecules are reduced. So we need to talk about this chemistry term. Let me go back to here. This is where it's reduced at. NAD molecule is reduced to NADH. Now what that means is you've added an electron to it. Actually, you add 2 electrons to it. NAD plus, you add 2 electrons, and it reduces it to NADH. In this type of system, this is an oxidation reduction type reaction. In this system, if you go in this direction, NAD plus 2 electrons gives you NADH. You've added energy to the NADH molecule. So just like ATP is higher energy, NADH is higher energy than the NAD plus is. So what you get are 2 NADH molecules reduced. They've gained energy. All right. 2 ATP molecules are consumed. However, you make 4 ATP in the process. See, in this reaction, I made 2 over here, I made 2 over here. So I've got a total of 4 that were produced for ATP. However, because I had to use 2 to get things started, that was at the beginning, I had to use 2 right here to get the reaction started. That means that I only have a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. So that's the total amount of energy that I can make from one glucose molecule is 2 ATP molecules